King Charles entered the private room at Windsor, expecting a routine family gathering. Instead, he found Catherine standing beside a sealed glass case containing Prince Philip's restored naval compass and a handwritten pledge bearing the signatures of the monarchy's next generation. What she announced moments later was not merely a memorial. It was a new royal tradition, created in secret, and the king could not find a single word to answer her. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine held her ground as the silence deepened. She had created the Prince Philip Service Oath, an annual promise asking working royals to dedicate 1 year to public service, shaped by the late Duke's values. The oath was not a law or command. It was a voluntary family pledge, designed to turn remembrance into action and duty into something personal. William watched his father move toward the case. The Prince of Wales understood why the compass mattered, because it had guided Philip through naval service before royal life changed his path forever. Its worn surface carried scratches that Charles recognized instantly. The monarch placed one hand against the table, leaned closer, and stopped breathing as grief broke through the control he showed in public. Catherine felt the weight of that reaction. She had wanted to honor Philip, not reopen a wound Charles had spent years protecting. Yet she knew why this moment mattered. The tribute gave the younger generation a living standard to follow, and it placed service, rather than ceremony, at the center of the family's future. It also made her the first Princess of Wales in modern royal history to establish a permanent tradition dedicated to a deceased royal consort, meaning the husband of a reigning queen. Charles lifted the handwritten pledge and found signatures from those expected to carry the monarchy forward. Then he learned the secret behind it. Catherine had spent more than a year speaking through documented private meetings with Philip's former staff, military companions, and charity leaders, gathering the principles he had repeated throughout his life. She had done it without alerting the royal household, the inner team that manages the sovereign's official work. William noticed his father's expression change again. Beneath the signatures, Catherine had written one final message directly to Charles. The king read it once, then a second time, but still said nothing. Before he could answer, everyone in that room understood that the tribute was carrying far more than Philip's memory. It was exposing old regrets, private loyalties, and the unspoken expectations closing around the future of the crown. For the public, Prince Philip had been a commanding royal figure, defined by discipline, blunt humor, and decades of service. For Charles, he had been something far more complicated, a demanding father whose approval often felt difficult to reach. Catherine understood that history. She also understood that beneath the king's composure remained a son who had never fully resolved what had been left unsaid before Philip's death. Charles kept his eyes fixed on the handwritten message, but the room around him seemed to disappear. He had admired his father's strength, endurance, and devotion to the monarchy, yet admiration had never erased the distance between them. Philip demanded resilience from everyone around him, especially his eldest son, and that pressure had followed the monarch from childhood into the crown. The wound mattered because Charles was now carrying the same institution that had shaped their bond, and any tribute to Philip also forced him to confront what their relationship had cost. Catherine felt that danger before the gathering began. Her connection with the late Duke had formed through quiet approval rather than dramatic praise. He respected her discipline, her focus on family, and her refusal to turn every act of service into a public performance. The Duke of Edinburgh was the title given to Philip as the husband of Queen Elizabeth II. But inside the family, his influence came less from rank than from the standards he expected others to meet. William watched his wife carefully as his father continued reading. The prince knew the compass carried two meanings at once. It represented his grandfather's life of service, but it also carried Charles's private hope that Philip had understood him more deeply than he ever showed. That tension placed Catherine in an almost impossible position. Her tribute could comfort the king, or it could appear to claim ownership over memories that belonged to Charles and his siblings. William had raised that fear during a private conversation before the unveiling. He asked whether she was certain his father should discover the oath without warning. Catherine answered that Charles needed to experience the tribute first as a son, before examining it as sovereign. A sovereign is the reigning monarch, the person who formally leads the crown and carries its constitutional duties. Her decision was risky, but she believed protocol would bury the emotion if officials reached the idea first. Catherine also carried one secret she had not yet explained. Philip's former equerry had given her access through a documented private meeting to a worn desk folder containing 3 handwritten principles: service before comfort, action before praise, and loyalty without performance. An equerry is a trusted royal officer who assists a senior member of the family with official and personal duties. Charles reached the final sentence at last. "Your father's direction still guides this family through you." His lips parted, but no answer came. The silence was not rejection, yet it was not acceptance either, because the king had just realized Catherine knew something about Philip's final years that had never been discussed openly inside the family. The secret tribute did not begin in a palace office or during an official planning meeting. It began months earlier inside a quiet room at Windsor, when one elderly former aide placed a small wooden box in front of Catherine and told her that Prince Philip had worried the monarchy might one day remember his titles but forget his purpose. What she found inside became the point of no return. Catherine had entered that meeting with a much smaller idea. She wanted to create a limited charitable project linked to youth development, outdoor education, and the kind of practical discipline Philip had always valued. It would carry his name, support young people, and fit safely within existing royal work. Nothing about it was meant to challenge the family. Nothing about it was meant to change tradition. Commander Richard Hale changed everything when he placed the box between them. The fictional former naval aide had served Philip during the final decade of his public life, and had kept a documented account of their private conversations. A naval aide is a trusted military assistant who supports a senior figure with official duties and personal arrangements. Hale told Catherine that the Duke feared future generations might praise his service without understanding the sacrifice behind it. The click of the wooden lid cut through the silence. Inside rested the damaged compass and an unsigned card bearing one sentence: "A family survives only when duty becomes personal." Catherine read the words twice. Hale explained through his written account that Philip had kept the message near him during his final years, returning to it whenever he worried that royal service was becoming too distant, polished, or protected from real effort. Catherine remained alone after the aide departed. She turned the compass in her hands and understood that a conventional memorial would preserve Philip's name without preserving his discipline. That mattered, because portraits could be admired without changing anyone, and ceremonies could end without demanding sacrifice. His legacy needed to place pressure on the living, especially those preparing to inherit greater responsibility. William listened carefully when she later described the meeting. Catherine told him that statues and speeches slowly become part of the background, but a repeated promise forces every generation to answer the same difficult question: what are you personally willing to give? The prince understood the danger immediately, yet he also saw why his wife could no longer settle for a safe tribute. Catherine made one decision that protected the oath from becoming a command. Every participant would sign voluntarily. A royal command is an instruction issued through the authority of the sovereign, while this pledge would depend on conscience rather than force. That freedom gave it moral weight, but it also created a threat. A senior court official warned Catherine during a recorded private briefing that the annual pledge could be seen as building a rival center of authority around her and William. The warning reached Charles before the unveiling, and when he finally called Catherine into a private room, grief gave way to the confrontation everyone had feared. The door closed behind Catherine, leaving her alone with the king, and the object that had already shaken him. Charles did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He placed Philip's compass between them, looked directly at his daughter-in-law, and asked why a tribute involving his father, his family, and the future identity of the monarchy had been created without his knowledge. Catherine felt the force of the question before she answered. No aides, secretaries, or relatives stood nearby to soften the exchange. The sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch with final authority over official royal matters, wanted to know why Philip's belongings had been restored and connected to a new family tradition before formal approval had been granted. Charles saw more than secrecy. He saw a decision about his father moving forward without him. Charles pressed one hand against the table and told her that grief did not remove his right to protect Philip's memory. The king had spent years carrying private regret, while the public expected dignity, and now an emotional wound had become part of a plan he had never reviewed. That mattered, because the tribute touched both his place as a son and his authority as monarch. It also risked making the future of the crown appear shaped by decisions formed beyond his control. Catherine did not step back. She admitted that the plan had been kept secret because palace machinery would have turned it into a polished campaign before Charles could feel its meaning. Palace machinery refers to the officials, advisors, and approval systems that manage royal announcements and public work. She believed committees would have refined the emotion until nothing raw remained. Charles stared at her in disbelief, but Catherine continued. Philip had resisted empty ceremony throughout his life, she said, and he would never have wanted his memory guarded so carefully that it stopped challenging the family. She had not created the oath to embarrass the king. She had created it because duty without sacrifice could become performance, and because future generations needed more than speeches to understand the cost of service. The compass changed everything. Charles lifted it, turned it slowly, and noticed a faint engraving Catherine had deliberately preserved during restoration. 2 childhood initials remained scratched beneath the worn metal, placed there by Philip decades earlier. The monarch traced them with his thumb, and his anger faltered. For one brief moment, the confrontation disappeared, leaving only a son confronting proof that his father had kept something deeply personal. Catherine chose that moment to reveal the final truth. The first signature on the oath did not belong to William or to her. It belonged to Princess Anne, who had studied the pledge in a documented private meeting and signed it without hesitation. Anne's name changed the balance immediately. The tribute was no longer Catherine's private vision. It carried the support of the one person whose loyalty to Philip could never be questioned. Princess Anne had not signed the document out of sentimentality. She had studied every word, challenged its purpose, and demanded to know whether Catherine was building a genuine standard of service or merely creating a polished symbol for public admiration. Her eventual decision gave the oath legitimacy, but it also forced Charles to confront an uncomfortable truth about where moral influence now rested inside the family. Anne had spent her life proving that duty should be measured through work rather than applause. She understood Philip's values because she had lived by them, often without seeking praise. That gave her signature unusual weight. It mattered because the tribute could no longer be dismissed as Catherine's emotional project, and because Charles now faced support for the oath from the sibling whose judgment on their father's legacy carried the greatest authority. Anne had challenged Catherine during a documented private conversation before signing anything. She insisted that the pledge contain no promise of popularity, public affection, or institutional reward. Every participant had to complete measurable service during the coming year. The oath, meaning a formal promise of personal duty, would demand results rather than symbolic attendance. Catherine accepted the condition without hesitation. She understood that Anne's support strengthened the tribute, but she also knew it could make the king feel surrounded by a decision formed beyond his control. The princess warned her that once the document carried royal signatures, Even William could not treat it as ceremonial theater. Catherine agreed. The future king would be judged by the same standard as everyone else. Charles soon received advice from the Lord Chamberlain during a recorded palace briefing. The Lord Chamberlain is the senior official who oversees major royal household operations and ceremonial arrangements. He explained that the monarch could suspend the initiative, place it under official review, or absorb it into an existing royal foundation. Each option preserved legal control, but none removed the emotional danger. Charles held the constitutional authority, yet canceling the tribute would carry a brutal cost. It could look like a rejection of Philip's principles and a dismissal of Anne's judgment. It could also deepen the growing impression that Catherine and William represented a more demanding vision of service than the existing palace structure was ready to accept. The family meeting began under that pressure. Charles placed his pen beside the unsigned oath and looked directly at William. The king did not ask whether the tribute was moving. He asked whether the prince saw it as a memorial to Philip or as a declaration of how he intended to reign. William felt every eye turned toward him. Catherine remained still. Anne waited without rescuing him. His answer would determine whether the pledge remained a private act of love or became the first visible statement of a changing monarchy. William had spent the entire evening trying to protect both his wife and his father from a conflict neither had intended to create. But when Charles demanded a direct answer, neutrality disappeared. The Prince of Wales looked at the oath, then at Catherine, and finally told the king that Philip's legacy could not survive through remembrance alone. It had to influence how the crown behaved next. William spoke carefully, but he did not weaken the truth. He saw the service oath as both a tribute and a standard for the next reign. The crown, meaning the monarchy as an institution, rather than only the person wearing it, could not praise sacrifice while avoiding the demands Philip had placed on himself. That mattered because William would one day inherit responsibility for the family's direction, and because every word he spoke now sounded like a promise about the kind of king he intended to become. Catherine felt the pressure tighten around the room. William insisted that she had not tried to claim Philip's legacy or turn it into personal power. She had created a structure that required everyone, including herself, to prove their commitment through action. The prince reminded his father that the oath offered no protection from failure. It would expose empty promises as easily as it rewarded real service. Charles heard something harsher beneath the explanation. To the king, the argument suggested that the monarchy needed a moral correction, not a memorial. He had spent years defending continuity, carrying duty through grief, and protecting the crown from instability. Now his own son appeared to say that remembrance without change was not enough. Catherine watched father and son stand on opposite sides of the table, and guilt struck immediately. She had wanted Philip's memory to unite them. Instead, the tribute had forced two generations to defend different meanings of duty. Her success was beginning to feel like suffering, because every step forward placed greater strain on the family she had hoped to strengthen. Charles made his decision with controlled finality. He postponed the planned public announcement and ordered every copy of the pledge returned to Windsor until he gave formal approval. A public announcement is the palace's official release of a decision to the nation and the wider world. By delaying it, the monarch stopped the initiative before it could gain a life beyond his control. Anne removed her glasses and closed the folder sharply. She told Charles in a documented family exchange that Philip would have considered delay a polite form of refusal. The king did not answer her. William remained beside Catherine, but even his support could not remove the damage already done. Catherine returned to the empty room after the meeting and stopped beside the glass case. The restored compass was gone. Charles had taken it without explanation. The missing object appeared to mark the end of her plan, until a late-night message summoned Catherine to the place where the king had gone to face his father's memory alone. Near midnight, Catherine entered the private chapel at Windsor without William, Anne, or a single palace official beside her. Charles stood near the front, holding Philip's compass in both hands. For the first time since the tribute began, he was not speaking as sovereign, guardian of protocol, or head of the family. He was speaking as a grieving son, who finally admitted what had left him speechless. Charles had removed every barrier that shaped their earlier confrontation. The private chapel was a place reserved for worship, reflection, and family remembrance, but that night it became something more personal. No advisors could control the words. No officials could reshape the meaning. The king had asked Catherine to come alone because he no longer wanted to answer as monarch. He wanted to speak as the child Philip had once tried to prepare for a life neither of them fully understood. Charles turned the compass slowly and revealed a memory he had never shared in public. As a boy, he had been fascinated by the needle and the certainty with which it pointed north. Philip had warned him that knowing the right direction meant nothing without the courage to follow it. The monarch repeated those words from a recorded private family conversation, and Catherine finally understood why the restored object had struck him so deeply. Charles admitted that his silence during the unveiling had not come from anger. The engraving had overwhelmed him. His father had preserved a small connection the king believed time had erased, and that discovery had reopened years of admiration, hurt, and unfinished longing. It mattered, because Charles had built his public life around control. Yet the compass proved that even a monarch could still ache for a father's approval. Catherine answered with equal honesty. She confessed that she had feared crossing a boundary, but Philip's private principles had created a responsibility she could not ignore. She had not wanted to claim his memory. She had wanted to prevent it from becoming safe, distant, and powerless. Charles then revealed the deeper reason for delaying the oath. He feared the next generation might one day remember his reign with the same emotional distance he sometimes felt toward Philip. The pledge had forced him to face that possibility before he was ready. Catherine stepped closer and assured him that the tribute did not replace his leadership. It proved that Philip's discipline still lived through the standards Charles had carried into the crown, meaning the enduring institution of monarchy and its duties. Charles placed the compass back into her hands. Then the king asked whether there was still room for one more signature at the top of the pledge. By sunrise, the service oath carried his name, but the palace still had to reveal how Catherine's secret act had become a historic royal commitment. The announcement reached the public shortly after the morning bells rang at Windsor. What had begun as a hidden tribute was now presented as a permanent annual promise, signed by Charles, Anne, William, and Catherine. Yet it was not the formal statement that captured the country. It was one image from the chapel steps that showed the king carrying his father's compass, while Catherine walked silently beside him. Buckingham Palace confirmed the Prince Philip service oath through an official morning statement. Buckingham Palace is the monarch's main administrative headquarters, where major royal decisions are announced to the public. The pledge would return every year, and each participating working royal had to choose a clear service objective, complete it, and account for the result before the next gathering. Charles made one decision that changed the meaning of the announcement. He approved Catherine's name as founder of the tradition, ensuring her work would not disappear behind anonymous palace language. That recognition mattered, because royal initiatives are often presented as collective efforts, and because the king was publicly accepting that his daughter-in-law had shaped something permanent inside the monarchy. William felt pride rise beside relief. He had feared the oath would leave his wife isolated and deepen the division between father and son. Instead, Catherine's private idea had become a shared promise, carrying all 4 signatures. The prince understood that the family had not simply avoided a fracture. They had turned it into a statement of unity. The crowd outside Windsor Castle gave the story its human voice. Beneath the round tower, the large central tower rising above the royal residence, people gathered with handwritten signs reading, "Service is the tribute." One elderly man held the message above his head, while the crowd repeated the words, turning a palace announcement into something the public could claim as its own. A national newspaper pushed the emotion even further. Its front page showed Charles holding Philip's compass beneath the headline, "The King finds his father's direction." Broadcasters repeated the phrase throughout the morning, but the strongest reaction centered on the monarch's expression. His lowered eyes and unguarded grief revealed something no official statement could explain. Catherine watched the response with quiet relief, while William stayed close enough to understand how much the moment had cost her. Charles had accepted that remembrance could hurt and heal at the same time. The king had also allowed the country to see that strength did not require hiding sorrow. The world had witnessed the announcement, but the true verdict still waited inside the family, where Charles would explain exactly why Catherine's secret tribute had changed his understanding of the monarchy's future. The final gathering was smaller than the unveiling and quieter than the confrontation. There were no cameras, advisors, or official speeches. Charles stood before Catherine, William, and Anne, with the signed oath resting beside Philip's compass. This time, the king did not struggle for words. He understood that Catherine had not taken possession of his father's memory. She had returned its meaning to the entire family. Charles looked directly at his daughter-in-law and thanked her for creating a tribute that demanded more than remembrance. The royal family, meaning the monarch and close relatives who represent the crown through public duties, would not simply praise Philip's past. They would continue his work through measurable service. That difference mattered, because admiration fades when it asks nothing from the living, while responsibility can shape every generation that follows. Charles admitted through a documented private family conversation that the surprise had first felt like a loss of control. He had believed an intimate part of his father's legacy had been handled without him. Yet the secrecy had also protected something precious. It had allowed the king to encounter the tribute as a son before answering as sovereign, and that emotional truth had changed everything. Catherine finally confessed what she had carried from the beginning. Her greatest fear was not rejection or public criticism. It was causing Charles pain while trying to honor the man who had shaped William and influenced the monarchy's deepest ideas about duty. She had known one wrong decision could make the tribute feel like an intrusion rather than an act of love. Charles answered without hesitation. He placed Philip's compass in Catherine's hands and asked her to carry it during the first annual service gathering as founder of the oath. The annual gathering would be the formal meeting, where each signer renewed the promise and accounted for the service completed. By giving her that role, the monarch made her place in the tradition permanent. Anne broke the silence with quiet approval. She told Catherine that Philip would have respected the oath because it demanded action, discipline, and personal responsibility. The princess had tested the pledge harder than anyone, and her praise confirmed that the tribute had survived both emotion and scrutiny. William watched his father embrace Catherine and understood what had truly been healed. The moment repaired more than a disagreement. It strengthened the bond between the present sovereign and the woman preparing to support the next reign. Catherine made history not by creating another ceremony, but by transforming private memory into living duty. She gave Charles a new way to understand his father and united 3 generations around a promise they could no longer treat as empty words. Philip's compass returned to its case, but its direction had already been accepted. Charles would carry the past, Catherine would protect its purpose, and the future monarchy would prove its worth through service. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.